Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-host, Wilfred Riley, and our guests this week are Inez Stepman. She's a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum and host of the High Noon podcast there, and Adaam James Levin-Areddy. He is the senior producer at The Dispatch and the co-host of Uncertain Things podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's great to be here.
So I wanted to have some people who have thoughts, lots of people who have thoughts, but to talk about the issue with what has been going on since the attack and what's been going on since the attack of, what is it, last Saturday, October 7th, the Hamas attack on Israel. And it's had some surprising, some not so surprising reactions across the world. And we can get into the complicated relationship there. And I think we should talk about that briefly. But at first, I want to start with the attack itself. What are your thoughts on, I think as I was saying when we started, the attacks, as horrific as they were, should have been a story in itself. But what has, for me, grown to become almost the bigger story is the reaction that we've seen around the world, and particularly because we live here, and we're all, unlike Will, in New York. So what we see right outside our front door as a reaction. So talk a bit about how that's been to deal with and what you think about that reaction. Inez, you can go first.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's horrific to watch, especially for people who are a little bit younger, millennials, Gen Z, especially Jewish Americans in those age bands. The precarity of Israel's existence has always been kind of a matter of historical record, right? Kind of a matter of a default of history. And I think this is a good reminder that it's not, right? That is only a matter of the last couple decades, maybe 3 decades, right? 4 decades. But before that, the precarity and the sort of existential nature of Israeli existence is now up for in the air. Not completely. I mean, obviously, Israel is a powerful and rich country, can defend itself. But I don't think we've seen this kind of existential threat to Israel while most of us in those generations were alive, right? 73 would really be the last time that something like this took place. And I think some of the reaction that you're seeing at home and in America from Jews is a realization of that from the younger generations, who just always had in the back of their mind that Israel will be fine because it's a powerful and rich country, the first world military, and this is a good reminder that there are 9 point something million people in Israel, and they're surrounded by nearly 500 million people in the countries around them that hate them and don't want them to exist. That's inherently a precarious position. In terms of the domestic response, I mean, to me, and I can kick this off by being provocative, it's clear that a large portion of the Arab street is now in Paris and Berlin. We used to talk about back in the 10 years ago when we were talking about Gaza again, right? We were talking about the reaction of the Arab street. Well, that reaction is now very firmly moved, not only in the streets of Muslim countries, but in the streets of European capitals. America, to a lesser extent, I think, but still we're seeing this. And I'll wrap it here just because I'm going on. But I think there is a very interesting marriage between certain elements of the left wing domestically here and this explicitly not just pro-Palestinian, but pro-Hamas, rhetoric and demonstrations. And there's an interesting alliance between sort of native-born leftists and recent immigrants.
And Adaam, anything you want to add?
Well, I should say, to clarify first, I'm Israeli, so
right.
It's a disclaimer. And part of that disclaimer is that I did not really catch any sleep since the massacre. and I've been running almost exclusively on rage fumes and alcohol. And since it's too early for alcohol, I apologize if the result is that I will fail to complete a full coherent thought today. But thinking of the response of the nations to the event, I don't think that anyone who's not Jewish or even who's not Israeli really understand the sort of psychic break that this moment has caused for so many people in the way we see ourselves in the world. And it's not like Israelis had ever any delusions about how the country is perceived by the enlightened West. We always understand that there is a problem in being able to convey the asymmetrical strategic trap in which Israel finds itself fighting against terrorist organizations, given how powerful its military is, given how occasionally prosperous its economy is, and how that position, the position of being a successful minority, places Israel as a categorical villain in the perception of a lot of people. We always understood that, and we always kind of like learned to scoff at the absurdities of coverage and the absurdities of intellectual discourse around Israeli and regional geopolitics. I think what we all assumed tacitly is that should there be a second Holocaust, the world will, the left will pause and say, oh, we fucked this one up, didn't we? We got this all wrong. What we didn't expect was for there to be such an explicit case of a intentional massacre of citizens at such a scale, and for the immediate reaction a day after, to be celebrations in the streets. None of us, even the most, I think, radicalized, hawkish right-wingers in Israel, imagined that this reaction is plausible. And seeing this has completely changed, warped, radicalized the thinking of, I think, Jews probably in general, but certainly Israelis or Israeli connected people, individual thinkers. And I can't tell you what the implications of this might be, but I'm feeling it emotionally. You can hear it in my voice, but I'm also reading it in the writings and the exchanges of some of the most measured, dovish thinkers on the Israeli side. Mm-hmm. Something has changed, and it's a little scary, but that this is the reality we're living in. It's the true scary thing was to discover just how dispensable Jewish lives are.
I got, in this short amount of time, at least 5 things I want to make sure we cover briefly. But Will, I want to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, so my thought on the reaction actually was that it was fairly unsurprising from the global left and media, assuming that those are different things. And I hope it was eye-opening to a lot of people. I mean, so first of all, the incident itself, like I actually am a practicing political scientist. I mean, it's as clear a casus belli for war as I've ever seen. I mean, it was the attempts to deny what happened are just bizarre. I mean, if you're on Telegram or even Twitter, there are videos of, I mean, many of the things that happened. Hamas paratroopers essentially attacked a rave and killed 260 innocent people. I mean, the most 5 of them, I think, could potentially have been caught in a crossfire. They were just massacred. Many were raped. And this went on and on. I mean, without bringing up every disturbing memory, I mean, a kibbutz was attacked. 100 people were killed there. I believe the total death toll was 1,400 Israelis, and then the 1,200 or so terrorists inside the state of Israel were also, of course, killed. I mean, there was a firefight that involved IDF forces there. So, I mean, obviously, one of the more notable human rights atrocities, just objectively, that's occurred in quite some time. I mean, the obvious parallels 9/11 here in the States, but the reaction. Like I said, I don't think it was all that surprising because my assumption is that what people say is generally a reflection of what they think. So, I mean, I think that a lot of people, my hope would be that for a lot of moderate Jewish Americans and for a lot of other people, this opened some eyes, bluntly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people say this stuff all the time. Like, my goal is decolonization globally, is a very common remark in academia. And people who make that point are quoting Franz Fanon, who said, by any means necessary, we need to remove the white and the Jew and the non-native. These are all quotes. Also, the Syrian, which refers to Lebanese Arabs, from all of our countries. These people need to be killed. They need to be gone. That's what people are talking about. So when after the attack happened, people started saying things at Harvard University, tenured professors at Yale, like, well, we can't critique patterns of decolonial resistance. Excuse the language. This is what these motherfuckers think. Like, it's a coherent argument on the revolutionary left that people have been making for 40 years. And I think there's been a tendency to look at people sitting across from you in a Chicago or Brooklyn cocktail party and think, this person can't actually be a lunatic. They can't actually mean this. But just as people worldwide have supported fascist parties representing the worst of the right, no, these guys they're being quite serious. And if you actually look at rhetoric from the academic left, I mean, Jews have obviously been a group targeted more than almost any other in recent as well as longer term history. But very similar things are said about white Americans in general. I mean, very similar things are said about minority conservatives. Very similar things are said about traditional or quote unquote gender critical women. The idea, if you're a revolutionary, if you're at all serious and in your own bizarre way honorable, is that you're going to have to fight or kill the people that are opposing the revolution. So because I always took this seriously, I mean, when this happened, I mean, the first reaction, other than my fiance gave some money to the IDF and we called some friends to see if they're okay. But other than that, the reaction was, well, we're going to see a lot of this. I mean, the immediate kind of Bodog betting markets prediction is what they're going to do is pretend to apologize for the attack or pretend to criticize the attack and then immediately begin criticizing the Israeli response.
Right.
And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing people like Rashida Tlaib, Mehdi Hassan, Ilhan Omar. I mean, some of these people are in Congress saying this is genocide. Sayura Rao, that's the term that's apparently gone out in the talking points memo. Whatever happened to Israel, we must now stop the Jews, often by that term, from committing genocide against Palestinian civilians. So yeah, I mean, disgusting, but not entirely unsurprising. And hopefully people are now aware. No, they mean what they're saying. When they say from the sea, they mean kill the Jews. Like,
but what have been your my impression, my delusion was that it's very cheap to talk about decolonization without seeing the consequences of it, and that the consequences, that seeing the bloodshed would shatter something in the naivete of easy ivory tower academic thinking. I think that was my shock.
Yeah, I was also unsurprised. I mean, I agree with Will. Like, that actually the reaction on campuses and stuff didn't surprise me at all. What did surprise me actually was the opposite, that there was some substantial pushback from people who were previously in the center. I didn't expect that. So I guess I was surprised in the opposite direction. And like, well, I hope some people, have their eyes opened from this. But, look, people who there were a lot of people who were very comfortable, some of them Jewish, some of them not, but I think very comfortable with the oppression pyramid. And like Will said, speaking some frankly hateful rhetoric about, white Americans, about the West broadly. And they felt comfortable slotting themselves into the oppressed categories of that oppression pyramid. And in large part, I see some of this, the reaction maybe is slapping them into thinking that, like, no, actually, you're going to be in the oppressor category, and all of that rhetoric that you thought was okay when directed, is now directed at you in a very direct way. The rhetoric that you would have excused if it was about, white is now directed at you in this very, very concrete way. so yeah, I really do hope that people's eyes are opened. And that's kind of what I was hinting at in my initial thing, that this is a marriage between this kind of, new left, 1968 onward left, and this cause, or Hamas, or cheering this kind of slaughter. It seems like superficially it's easy to dunk on the Queers for Palestine guys, right? Whatever. Like, you see this sort of superficial contradiction. But I actually think this is an instance where I guess the online term is woke more correct than the mainstream. I think they understand they have the same enemies. And that list of enemies not only includes Israel, it includes Jews, but it also includes America, the West more broadly, specifically, white, straight, blah, 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 blah people. Right. And of course, these are not like impermeable categories, and there are plenty of people who fall into one side or the other, and they have their own list of, angry messages for those people who don't fall clearly into one of these categories. But I think it's a simple matter of recognizing that you have common enemies, and therefore that some superficial disagreement, if one can call tossing gays off a building superficial disagreement. But yeah, I mean, I think they're right to think that they fundamentally have similar enemies in mind, and so therefore it makes sense for them to be friends.
Well, when you talked about this pyramid, and Adaam talked about Jews being seen, and Israel specifically being seen as this successful minority kind of thing, and a lot of people who are talking about this on a larger scale are saying part of this, the reason it's so celebrated on the college campuses, is because there's an ideology that's been brewing, and it all ties together, like you're saying, and they've just been allowing it to fester. But you talk about, I agree with you. I said the same thing. Someone, I think Batia, asked me, were you surprised by this? I was saying I was more, in some ways, a little more than you and Will. I was surprised not by what happened on college campuses. That was expected to me. I was kind of surprised a little bit by the number of people that joined them. But really what surprised me more were the people who decided to speak up. And I didn't get a chance to speak to you, but I told Adaam and some others, I had been joking about this for a while, right? Over these years, like, because Will and I talk a lot about this culture and wokeness, and now sometimes you have to fight against it bluntly, and sometimes you have to play their language game because they're changing words. But then from the time Whoopi got in trouble about the Holocaust, I saw that, and I'm like, no, I think I'm taking this seriously. And what I said to them was, it's time for Jews to stop saying they're white. Right. So if you think about it, as all these academics, right? So let's say we're talking in the woke vein, not about what happened recently. And they'll be talking about this race situation and this, that, or the other. And they'll say, well, I can't really say that. As a white person, I can't really say that. Right. So it's almost like, that behind the scenes, that this deep-seated separation, this deep-seated anti-Semitism, occasionally you talk about it, but you're allowing yourselves to be looked at as part of this, like you say, oppressive versus oppressed. You're allowing yourself to be seen as oppressor and kind of leaning into their argument, right? So I'm like, you should just stop saying that. Just this index, like, no, stop including me in this pyramid that you're trying to slot me into. And then at the same time, when it's comfortable for you to say that I am, part of this, this elite. Obviously, from a number standpoint, it makes sense. Obviously, there's unique things. There's a hatred. There's an attack. There are things unique to Jews, and then they're not all white, right? So why allow yourself to be, pigeonholed as oppressors? What do you say to that?
Look, I mean, I think the entire construct is ridiculous, and it shows. And actually, that I'm glad you brought up Whoopi's comments, because I actually, to some extent, defended her in the sense that I thought they were just stupid and not anti-Semitic. It shows the inapplicability of this sort of racialist, but very American context thinking, where there are like two primary, which is not even true in America, but you definitely see in sort of some of the critical theories and all of that stuff, this like basically dividing people up into black and white, right? And these are the two major this is the fault line in America, racial fault line in America. And it's just stupid. It's stupid to apply it in the world. I remember initially when people were trying to think of if Putin is going to invade or not, and he was amassing troops on the border with Ukraine and so on. They were trying, people were trying to find a way to slot this into this racial mess and making absolute fools of themselves in the process. Right?
Say something about they were only letting the white people into Poland and other countries and not letting the black people in.
Yeah, like that was the ones that was the story, and of course it was the actually, by the way, that story was kind of funny. They were students studying actually from other countries, I think actually Western countries, but they were Black students studying, and they were trying to cross the border, but nobody had any documentation. Right, Ukraine is an overwhelmingly white country, so like they have people, they question people a little more, right? These sort of foreign students. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is like that I see this more as stupidity, and it shows how when you actually go back, for example, with what Whoopi said about the Holocaust, the completely stupid way of framing it. Oh, it's not racial because in her mind, there's no ethnic distinctions between white people. Right, like that it can't be racial because it's not black versus white.
Who they were including in the murder during the Holocaust. Right, they found a way to find out who they were trying to kill.
Yeah, it's just it's a construct that doesn't make any sense, except that it's fundamentally, to me the key characterization and why this alliance makes sense is because it is hatred of your own. It's hatred of America. And hatred of successful groups in America, and hatred of the West writ large, which Israel is part of the West, even if it's not European, right? And even deeper than that, I mean, it's sort of this Rousseauian hatred of civilization, as though like, civilization itself is what has made us vicious towards each other and made us hate each other. And what this attack showed, I think, so obviously clearly is, no, like this is the state of man. It's tribal and hateful and bloody. And actually, we have to learn and inculcate and preciously cultivate civilization, because that's what's difficult, is for us to actually live together in prosperity and peace. Like that's a fragile thing. The state of man is what we saw, right? And that's why I think, Will, I think we went back and forth a little bit about this on Twitter, but my initial thought was this is what it must have looked like being, in the American frontier and being raided by the Comanche, right? Right. And of course, everybody took that as like, oh, who was here first, colonialism, the whole construct. And that's not my point at all. It's simply like these two different levels of civilization in terms of how they conduct warfare. And the West has a problem. And I don't know that it's a solvable one. And it's much more immediate in the case of Israel than it isn't for America. But it nevertheless is a problem for America. And we're in asymmetrical wars for 20 years that we seem incapable of winning because of it, because our own values constrain us in this kind of warfare against an enemy that just doesn't acknowledge any of the sort of humanitarian or like even rules of warfare that we're willing to respect. And it's very, very difficult to wage war like that as a civilized and advanced Western nation, when you're waging a war that your enemy is not going to respect it. In fact, they're going to put their civilians intentionally and use them as a weapon of war. They're going to use those rules against you. And Israel now confronts this in like the most immediate way possible.
But one of the most confusing conversations
with one
all of us are trying to go ahead with.
Yeah, I actually think that this is a very important point. So like a term I sometimes half jokingly use is prey morality. Like, I think a big problem for the West is excessive empathy that's gone well beyond anything healthy into things that are insane, like empathy for your enemies. And I think it's important to realize that at some level, human moral rules are just made up. That doesn't mean they're not real. That doesn't mean they don't come from some kind of empathic sense inside man. Some people think they come from the various gods, but they don't exist in the way that rocks do. And a lot of people don't share them with us. And this is critically important. And this is something that's really bypassed in the whole conversation about Palestinian civilians. Like, Hamas wants as many dead Palestinian civilians as possible. It's a strategic aim of theirs. It's called the CNN strategy. They've written academic papers about it, or supporters of theirs have. So, I mean, obviously it matters to most people that they keep to their own honor code so they don't feel badly about themselves or something like this. I'm trying to be as polite as possible. But it's important to realize that, yeah, the default state of man was not actually everyone living in kind of Disney movie cities in the woods where no violence occurred and all the races were represented before like modern Western order or even Judeo-Christian order. That's not real. Like, the default state of warfare was just Indian raids. People would break the border. They would kill as many men as possible. They would take as many women as rape hostages bluntly as possible. And they'd wait for you to come after them. And then they'd ambush you. So, I mean, a refusal to accept that this is reality is extremely problematic. Whether or not case by case you should suspend your own ethics to fight primitive enemies, that's a different question. The British did a lot of complex writing on this. But like one final thing about this, like all this ties into the overall what I would call woke philosophy, which is that the only cause of gaps in performance between people is oppression. I mean, this is said like really bluntly all the time. Like Ibram Kendi, the only reason for any difference between races, either genetic inferiority, which must never be believed in, or racism. And that just isn't true. The average black guy is 15 years younger than the average white guy, so on. But that's the idea. And it leads into this. It leads into a hatred of successful groups, with the Jews as almost the archetypal middleman minority, by the way. But the idea is that the more successful you are, the more you must have oppressed someone else. So when you see the West currently dominant over the global South, the West must have taken its resources from these poor people. We are rich because Haiti was poor. And that's why you see Israel and a lot of other countries where it doesn't even make sense, El Salvador, South Africa, but slotted into this kind of paradigm. Like in this situation, the Israelis are the successful, slightly more white oppressor, so they must be bad. You're ignoring the reality, which is Indian raids, and you're going with your theory, which is sort of bullshit academic nonsense. But this is something people believe very profoundly. They are doing bad because we hurt them. So when they hit me, we have to hug them. And the response would be, I mean, from humans throughout history, no, kill them all, at least the adult fighting men that are fighting you. And that response is a lot more coherent.
No, it just reminded me of a conversation that I had recently with a person that I consider one of my most intelligent acquaintances, talking about the war in Gaza. I surprised her by letting her know that I've been involved in many connecting Iranians with Israelis because of the growing mutual support around what we might call Western values, liberal values, whatever you want to call it, and a recognition that there is some compatriotism between the two people. And when I said Western values, liberal values, she winced. And the idea that this civilizational progress around liberal values is something that people in Iran seek is so absurd to her and sounds to her like me colonializing the discourse.
Right.
And I'm telling there's nothing more what I've been obsessively calling peace privilege. There's nothing more peace privilege-y than thinking that the brown man doesn't want liberal values. The brown man doesn't want the modern standards of governance, of representation, of all those things that we consider the product of, God forbid, European Enlightenment.
Right. Individual rights.
Individual rights. It was so bizarre to me because clearly what they really want, the only thing they can want is a reconnection with their indigenous values, with their indigenous morality, whatever that might mean in that exotifying thought process. But the thing that blew my mind was that a second later, when I was talking about how Hamas strategically uses their own civilian life, Palestinian life, as actually dispensable, as where the incentives for Hamas is to raise the death toll in Gaza, she couldn't accept that, and her argument was, well, Occam Razor would say that people want to live, people want to preserve life and to preserve the life of their own societies. It's like, no, that's Occam Razor's based on liberal values.
The values you say they don't want.
The values you say they don't want.
Right.
One thing that has to be called out here is the liberal assumption that absent modern Western civilizational training, there would be morality in the sense we're talking about it. No, there wouldn't be. We made it up. Right. This is very
what was happening before?
Yeah, I'm sorry?
I said what was happening before.
Well, I mean, what was happening before?
There would be a moral framework. It would just be nothing like what we consider quote unquote moral today.
Yes. I mean, there's a human impact. There's actually a lot of fascinating research on this. And again, I think the 10 Commandments are a good idea. Like there are some basic human universals probably. But I mean, there is a human empathic sense. In fact, this exists for all pack animals. There are a lot of people researching this now. Like, do dogs and apes have a sense of fairness that the big cats don't seem to? They're just pure killers. And the answer is yeah. So, I mean, there is something from which comes our ideas about what is bad. Like, raping a tribeswoman is considered bad in almost every society. Cannibalism is generally considered bad unless you're running short of other food. But the idea that people in the state of nature, like Iroquois warriors, would have independently come up with Judeo-Christian morality is just nonsense. Like, history was worse than the present. It wasn't better. Some of the adult fighters may have been really honorable and interesting, but in general, no. Like, Hamas is an example of, Hamas is far more civilized than Comanche Raiders would have been. This is an example of what all of history would have looked like if we didn't develop certain laws that, again, we kind of decided would work and wrote down. Those don't naturally exist.
But to that,
I actually, can I just on one small point? I actually disagree with you. I think Hamas is worse for two reasons. One, because there exists an alternative, and you're not talking about 1,000 years of tribal life and warfare changing very rapidly overnight. And two, and this is where ideology comes in as opposed to just state of man that we're talking about, right? This is where that Islamic jihadist ideology comes in. It's totalizing, it's universalizing in a way that tribal life and tribal warfare is not. Right. So like the Comanche didn't want to wipe out every American. They were just raiding the same way that they raided all the other tribes. All the other tribes hated them for the same reason, right? Because they were also showing up in their villages, killing all the men and taking the women, right? So in that sense, it is like sort of more quote unquote innocent in a way. It doesn't have that like ideological tack and that sort of end goal of like, yes, we from the river to the sea, we need to wipe out all of the Jews. Like Comanche didn't care like what happened sort of beyond their immediate borders, and they didn't have a totalitizing ideology. That is actually very much a quote unquote modern phenomenon, or at least like a exactly post-Judean phenomenon, I think, to have that kind of like totalizing, universalizing, and anyway, that kind of force that adds to this level of frankly savagery that like the Western world is simply not willing to look in the face. And the other thing that we keep skirting around just as an implied fact, but I think is worth saying bluntly, is that, you know, democracy and liberal values, quote unquote, as applied to Gaza meant that Hamas got elected, right? That isn't what they want. In fact, whether they agree with this particular raid or not, it's difficult to conduct polling, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that a lot of people in the West, including Biden and including the remarks that George W. Bush came out and made, Condoleezza Rice, like sort of all of our uniparty sort of blob foreign policy people have all come out and made is this assumption that Palestinians don't support what Hamas did. And I think that's an unwarranted assumption. I think they probably do support. All the evidence we have says that they do support it. Now, that doesn't obliterate the distinction in war between civilian and combatant, a distinction, by the way, that is Western in its nature. It comes from the word citizen. It's Roman. Like, so that distinction itself is a Western idea. But I'm only saying that because every time I point this out, that actually Palestinians almost certainly do support this act by Hamas, in terms of the majority of people who live in Gaza probably support this. People immediately say, so you think it's okay to kill a child? No, but you have to grapple with the fact that this is a product of a particular civilization. It's not disconnected from the ideology or the religion or the cultural precepts or the structure of the people who birthed it. It's not, we don't think about war in any other context this way, but for some reason in this particular conflict, we are adverse to saying, no, like this is a direct outgrowth of the values that Palestinians embrace.
I wanted to get to that, Adaam, because we got to get to the attack itself. And if you want to add something to it, I'm coming to you anyway. But twice, Inez have pointed out the rules of war, and Will has been addressing morality. So we talked briefly about the people who just was on the side of Hamas and celebrating that kind of thing. But there's another common thing we got, and it was rules of war, right? They were like, it's sad what happened, but it was just a war between two combatants. And that's kind of what happened, as if, the norm for Israelis in the ongoing conflict in any other time would be to go around, to just paraglide into a concert and just start shooting people. They were like, yeah, that happened, but it was because of the way they would treat it. And I've had arguments with these people. So you're saying, so one of the examples I used was, most people say universally blacks were mistreated. So I say, take Jim Crow. Blacks have been treated poorly for so long, they couldn't have it anymore. So you had the Weather Underground come up and they said, no, we're going to do this. We got to be more aggressive, and we got to push the envelope. So we're going to bomb things, right? But they went a little far until they got to the point to shooting cops. But their initial thing was, we need to get attention, so we need to bomb stuff. But we don't want to kill innocents because we'll lose the people that agree with us. We'll lose our supporters. So we're going to call the building in advance, say we're going to blow things up, and then we blow stuff up. They never tried to blow things up with people. And even when they elevated to killing people, it was cops, it was combatants. So I would say, in that same vein, even if I give you the argument and Israel's the aggressor and the oppressor and they're bad, shouldn't you be blowing up government buildings? Should you be shooting up neighborhoods? You can't. So they're acting as if the attack was just normal. So I mean, again, back to the barbarism that was involved, but talk about the attack and how that's just why it's the reason why liberal Jews in America who've been quiet on this stuff are all of a sudden, like Inez says, she's surprised by the fact that they're talking. It's because it's different this time. Even to them, they noticed it was different. But somehow, some people say, it's just a couple of people having a fight.
I mean, first of all, you need to take into account that Hamas, but also the PLO before it, has mastered the art of talking from out of two sides of their mouths. It's the classic Arafat move, right? You hear them talk. They talk fluent Westernism to Western media, and then they speak completely differently in Arabic. That's why institutions like Memory are so valuable, where you can actually hear how Hamas thinks of itself. Mm-hmm. And that has gone way beyond cognitive dissonance. They just exist in two parallel worlds where they just move completely freely and unchallenged. So remember that when even just the other day, I don't remember who it was, but one of Hamas officials was interviewing, and it was not Hania, but he was pushed back on, well, you did harm citizens, and he just responded, well, we were only targeting soldiers. You were targeting soldiers in a music festival? Like, it's absurd, but straight-faced, that's how they will talk about this. And when somebody challenges them, oh, you kidnapped civilians, that's against the law of war, which is a whole other type of bullshit, but never mind. You kidnapped civilians. It's like, no, we were trying to kidnap soldiers. And they are not civilians, they are hostages. Sorry, they're not hostages, they are prisoners. They're prisoners to be traded for prisoners. So they are masters of manipulating language in a way that makes sense to the radical humanities undergrad in Brown. But it's not just media manipulation, it's also how they think of themselves. That's part of how they justify their actions. I've had an argument with a colleague the other day whether or not it even constitutes cognitive dissonance when you have so fully rationalized the contradictions that you don't see any tension between them. So fighting the Israeli oppressor is by default fighting an adversarial combatant, whether or not it's a soldier or a girl having a drink at an ice cream parlor.
Right.
Yeah, I had a very direct experience with this pretty early on, and count myself as lucky to having done so. It's now making the rounds again, second round of virality. I don't know if you guys seen the video from 2010 in UC San Diego between David Horowitz. There's an exchange.
Yes.
So that our like student groups and stuff brought David Horowitz. So I was like part of along with some other folks like organizing that event and was there in the room. When this girl, and she was actually kind of a unofficial representative of the Muslim Student Union, because they are obviously boycotting our event, but they sent her as like the lone representative, I think, to record what we were saying or whatever for a response. And she sort of says all the normal back and forth things and sounds like a normal sort of leftist campus activist, right? And then there's this moment where David Horowitz asks her, point blank, he cites the words of one of the Hezbollah leaders at the time. He says that he's glad that the Jews have gathered in Israel, so he doesn't have to take the trouble of hunting them down globally, so to kill every one of them, right? And he asks her very directly, for or against it. And she leans into the mic and she says, for it. But this is not the end of the story. That's the clip, right? Mm-hmm. So, by the way, the room went cold when she, I've never experienced anything like that in my life, but it was people realizing exactly maybe what some people are realizing now. No, this is not an academic debate. This person wants me dead. Right. But what was, I think, really revealing was afterwards. So she wrote an op-ed in our campus paper and then in her blog or something. And in the follow-up, it was every string on the woke harp, right? I felt intimidated by a white man. He had so much more power than me. I was misunderstood. I'm the, what is it? She said something literally like, if there's anyone marginalized in this conversation and this debate, it's me and people like me, because we're brown and Muslim and blah, blah, blah. But it was like the perfect two-step of, here's a base lizard brain tribal hatred, right? And then, but smart enough to layer on top of that, this is what will make me look good and garner me support among these Westerners. And I think she was, by the way, I wasn't sure. I think there were plenty of students in my school that were actually exchange students, but I think she stayed in the country after or whatever. But I'm not sure about that. I have a vague memory of what happened in 2010. But
somebody should find her.
She changed her name.
Oh, did she?
I think legally changed her name to avoid this. But in any case, that was a very concrete, and I count myself as lucky, like I say, of learning this when I was in college in this very direct way, that there is this two-step dance that Adaam was talking about, where it was just fortunate that one was in English. And then there's something we haven't addressed, which I think is really interesting, is I wonder if anything, to the extent that anything will change with people's eyes being opened, I think it's probably due to social media, right? Sure. And the way that this attack was broadcast, proudly by the people doing it, and those horrible videos that we've all seen, whether we wanted to or not, circumvented, right? Imagine if the only coverage of this was through the people who all put as headlines, like the New York Times, Israel bombs hospital, 500 children dead. Right. That's how every one of these conflicts has gone. Obviously, less in terms of the attack on Israel, but that's how each one of these conflicts has gone in the past. And I wonder
journalism by Hamas press releases.
That. Yeah, I wonder how much social media can circumvent that.
And then, as you said, less so much the attack, which is true, but we could question without social media how they would have recorded, how they would have written about it.
Yeah, how they would have reported it. None of these details, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, if the New York Times were able to just lie about this, it would be USA clearly loses in Vietnam. Just these sort of, but what we've seen from the media over time. The USA has lost wars or retreated from military conflicts in part because of mainstream network news and newspaper coverage. And the mass media, the few things I've read from skeptic research, is more critical of Israel and the USA. Yeah. So being actually able to see not 40 freedom hostages were taken or some Hamas nonsense, but naked, badly injured people in the back of pickup trucks. You realize what it would be like to be a Hamas hostage and all that. That definitely changed the entire tenor of the conversation.
But to the other thing you said, Inez, you were asking if it would change. Unfortunately, I don't think so, unless they understand that it's tied to everything that they're pushing. So if they can't draw a connection between this, the open rabid anti-Semitism, and what's happening on college campuses from oppressed and race and gender and everything, focus on differences before, unless they can connect the two, then they can just say that's bad and go right back to now let me tell you why you're different and let's focus on this other stuff. So I don't think it'll change. Anybody else?
I'm even more pessimistic than that. I think that you see people that do even with regards to Hamas specifically, already who may have been a little shaken by the original videos, already by the line of Hamas being a little sheepish and apologetic. Things got a little out of hand, you know.
Right.
Some bad apples, you know, some bad apples slaughtering 1,400 people.
Right. It was an accident.
It was an accident. No, we were only
It's hard
intending to.
for people to leave a worldview. Like, there are a lot of people that have a lot invested in this, and it's very difficult for them to realize, oh, our allies are actually Jew-hating lunatics.
Right. But Will,
But to go to the beginning, this is what I meant by my shock, because I thought that these images would suffice to, you know, change the conversation around this. And
so to clarify, I think the people that you're talking about, I was not surprised at all. But to the extent that I was surprised by the people who are, especially like, you know, Jewish rich people pulling their money from UPenn and stuff like that, I think wouldn't have happened without the direct social media to some extent. I mean, look, a lot of them have family and would get it that way. But I don't know. I tend to think that if this had all been mediated through the BBC and the New York Times, then even the people who do push back against this now, I feel like it would have fallen into the same lines instantly.
Right. And what do you think about this? I think some people, then another layer of people thought it was bad. It's like watching a crime on TV. It's like, oh, that's messed up. They think it's bad, but they didn't have a visceral reaction. They thought it was kind of no big deal, and they couldn't put it in perspective because of all these other things we talk about what the culture is focused on. So I talked to a lot of my Black friends, and I'm like, did you hear about it? To get their thoughts right? And they were like, yeah, it was really bad, but they didn't understand, you know. And I talk about what my friends are afraid of and what they talk about, whatever, and they didn't really get it. So the only way I can get them to understand it is I say, you remember when George Floyd died and BLM was everywhere? Every city was saying BLM, Black Lives Matter. Paris, you saw it all over the world, and they said yes. Now, take that exact same thing. It was like, what was it, A Time to Kill, when they told the jury to close their eyes and say, imagine if they were white. I said, now take that same number of people, the same passion with the Black Lives Matter signs, except they're burning them and they're saying blacks must die. That's what it's like. And then they can see. So even with the racism you say you deal with, you don't walk through the streets thinking people are saying, I wish you were dead. So imagine that, and you're a smaller minority. But I don't think a lot of people really grasp. So it's the reason why people think that it's bad, but you know, they're comparing it to the Ukraine. That's another thing. You're like, you see all this on the right, you're a hypocrite because you were saying we shouldn't be involved in Ukraine, and now you're supporting Israel. It's all the same. And I decided to just stay out of those conversations. But what do you say to that? I'm sure you all saw that, right? A lot of the, you know, whataboutism about if you're against war, you should be against all war, and the arguments of Israel shouldn't do this, they shouldn't do this, you didn't do this. So I just tweet, okay, what should they do? And then you get silenced, or I get attacked for asking, right? You're trying to trap me. I'm like, no, you're spending all your energy saying what they can't do. Maybe you should come up with some things they can do. Unless you think killing, oh, by the way, if you want to compare it to America, 40,000 people, unless you think killing 40,000 people doesn't warrant a response, then say that. But I don't think that's the case.
I mean, provided that
you're asking me, or...
Oh yeah, sorry.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we all had responses to that. I mean, so like my comment about that, first of all, I don't necessarily think it's unhealthy or evil not to care about everything that goes on in the world. I mean, there are levels of attachment to that. So I mean, like when I watch the Israeli but when I watch the Israeli counterbombing of Gaza, like I don't really care. I mean, my perception is these guys started a war. It's always unfortunate when a child dies or something like that, but this is retaliation in a war. We fought a war in Iraq against similar Arab fighters. I mean, that happens. I think that the attack on Israel did surprise me, and made me angry for a bunch of reasons. I don't like unprovoked violence. I favor civilization over what I consider barbarism. I mean, there were attacks on women and children, this kind of thing. So, I mean, I did comment on that a fair amount, but I could see where someone who is a Black American and who hasn't seen the videos because they're in a different corner of social media and so on simply wouldn't care very much. Like, you can't care about everyone in the world to the same extent you care about your wife or your mother or your best friend or something like that. I mean, what you're describing in terms of how to make that matter, I think makes sense. I've used similar techniques. And it also, by the way, comparison to either the Ukraine-Russia war or the Israel-Palestine war does illustrate how petty some of the problems in the USA are, right? I mean, like Black Americans say they're the victims of a genocide. That's Ben Crump's silly-ass book. Like, I mean, there actually are places in the world where genocide is a real risk. If you want to talk about Black people, there's a war in Ethiopia right now.
Sudan. Oh my God, that's a genocide in Ethiopia, but no one knows about.
Yes, and I mean, so I think there are a couple of different reasons for that. I mean, first of all, the
Yeah,
Ethiopian government, which is quite stable, doesn't exactly want to publicize it. I mean, there's not as much media discussion there. But
right.
again, I think it's
But you
logical
think
for
the brothers from the
Westerners.
diaspora would know?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't really know how much Hoteps know about real history. Moctezuma was black and all this, but I mean, but I think again, it makes sense for
you mean the real Jews?
well, yeah, the real Jews.
She's the winner. She's the winner.
I actually heard a Kentucky Cherokee guy tell me the other day that the Jews were Native American Indians. Like some of them got here and started.
So everybody wants. Do they
tribe.
still? I was gonna say everybody wants to be a Jew. Do they all still want to be a Jew? I
There's
mean,
a great line about that in Blazing Saddles where the chief is like, "Meshuggah, it's the truth" or whatever. But anyway, like, but all this banter aside, like, I think that teaching people to care is kind of important. Certainly with young males, people don't naturally care, etc. But I think the more important point that you raised is the people who say, well, I oppose what happened to Israel, but violence is never the solution, don't have a solution. What they actually would want is for Israel to drop a few bombs and then retreat so that no Palestinian civilians are killed. I mean, the children are real civilians, but there are a lot of armed fighters in Gaza that back Hamas. And then the same thing would happen in 2 years. So, I mean, I don't think that's a reasonable solution for Israel. And most countries, including, by the way, the USA and Ethiopia and France and Germany and Greece, have said that. Like, a green light, you guys are going to be fighting for a period of several months. So there is that distinction between, like, real national leaders, white, black, whatever, and, like, guys in the street with signs that say, like, homosexuals for Palestine.
queers.
Of course, my bad. No, I didn't object to like saying the term. I just forgot what was on the sign.
I was just saying because that's what the sign said. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the famous one. Yeah, of course. Yeah, you're right.
Right. No, I mean, I think that's the fundamental problem to maybe loop this back to some of the things we're talking about in the beginning about different civilizations. Right. If you're talking about the laws of war, the Western laws of war, right? Even the things that are within that Western law of war, Israel is frequently very harshly discouraged from doing, right? Like take this word proportionality, which is thrown around as though it's about bean counting and how many people can be killed on each side. And as people pointed out, what do you want Israel to do? Like launch a Comanche raid into, and take a corresponding number of Gazan women.
Which is also a total misunderstanding of what proportionality means.
That's what I was going to get to. Like, this is not what proportionality means. There are two steps to this law of war, which again is a Western construct, right? And the first is you don't intentionally target civilians. Okay, well, Hamas already, broke that more fundamental thing. But then when you are hitting a legitimate military target, there has to be a proportionality between the necessity of the target and the inherent collateral damage, which of course is going to be high in Gaza, exactly because, one, the reality of fighting in a densely populated urban area, which, by the way, door-to-door fighting that people seem to expect Israel to do as a matter of course, the U.S. military tries not to do because it kills your own soldiers at huge rates, right? It is a huge sacrifice to ask a country to sacrifice the more of their lives of their own soldiers, their own boys and girls, because to avoid the fact that there are civilians in military targets. And then on top of that, more basic thing about urban fighting, there's the intentionality of Hamas to actually gather civilians as the whoever referred to the CNN strategy, right? Like to use it as a weapon of war. So on top of that means there will be high civilian casualties no matter how Israel responds. If they respond at all, there will be high civilian casualties. And what's scary is even, just less than 2 weeks after this massacre, already you see the entire, both national and international media willing to run with this completely bullshit story that wasn't even true. But let's say that Israel had targeted a hospital after trying to evacuate it because there's major infrastructure, military infrastructure under the hospital. That's the reality of Gaza, right? So it would be a legitimate military target. And Israel goes further than most other militaries in terms of, doing whatever they call like the knock raids, the bomb that doesn't really explode to show that they're going to bomb the building, and sending notices and calling people and trying to evacuate civilians. But ultimately, they're going to have to hit military targets. And actually, that is proportionality. That is very much within the laws of war.
To you before you all make me a deadbeat dad.
No, you can go. I think
confirming stereotypes.
You can go. We'll just keep.
No, I will just say one thing. I will just say one thing because Inez summarized law of war perfectly, which again emphasizing this is this is fiction. This is Western liberal fiction, law of war, right? Like there's no categorical imperative around the law of war, and it is misapplied or misunderstood. But to the question of what to do with people who are anti-war, I just and finding the balance of which war you're. First of all, of course, you're entitled to have your own druthers and which wars to support and which not. My position is generally, if you are completely clueless or disinterested about a part of the world, that's totally great. But don't have strong opinions about that place. But my small issue, my small contribution is that the idea for me of being anti-war is in itself absurd. War will exist whether you're for or against it. The question is which war you choose to, or what you choose to fight for, or which side on which war you wish to take. But war will exist. This is, if there is one thing that is fundamental to human nature, is that we will find ways to try to destroy each other for different reasons. And all you get to do is to choose as strategically or as circumstantially relevant as possible what side of wars you're on.
He is Adaam James Levin-Areddy. She is Inez Stepman, Independent Women's Forum, and senior producer at the Dispatch and Uncertain Things. Adaam, Inez, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.